this time, we'd like to call to order the City Council Rail Committee meeting for Thursday, May 23rd, 2024. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Lithcott-Hames.
Here.
Councilmember Lowing.
Here.
Chair Burt.
Here.
For the record, all present.
Okay. So for folks who aren't familiar with our procedures. Okay. For folks who aren't familiar with our procedures, before going into the actual topics for today, which I think most people are here for, we have an opportunity for members of the public to speak on anything that's not covered by the agenda, but is within the purview of the committee. So do we have any speakers?
No, we do not.
Okay. All right. On that note, we'll go into our first update, which is Caltrain matters. And Ripon, I don't know if we have some updates from Caltrain.
Good afternoon, Chair. Ripon Bhatia, Senior Engineer with Office of Transportation. We do not have Caltrain and VTA staff here, but in our updates, we do have some information from the recent Caltrain activities. Caltrain electrification project is going full board, and they did the electrified Caltrain train tour at their station in San Carlos on May 11th, which was well attended, and a lot of people took advantage of the event to see these new trains. Also, they were planning for a train to in Palo Alto, which may be later in the fall. It's been rescheduled to a later date in the fall, and we'll keep Rail Committee notified about these activities. There's also an update on the quiet zone that we have completed our 70% design plans for the Palo Alto Avenue crossing. They are forwarded to FRA as well as to Caltrain and CPUC for their review and comments. Once we receive their comments and feedback, we'll make the final plans for permitting from both Caltrain as well as from California Public Utilities Commission under GO 88B requirements. So we're following those process, and things are moving along. For Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston crossing quiet zone, we have done our initial assessment, and we will likely share the information from that earlier report at the next Rail Committee meeting. We are planning to have a diagnostic meeting with CPUC, FRA, and Caltrain, and looking for scheduling that meeting with their staff. Finally, we do have bad news about a grant funding that was previously awarded to the city. And we have actually heard that the Governor Office is proposing to rescind the funding for the high priority grade separation projects in California. It's a $350 million funding under the Transit and Interregional State Capital Program funds, and City of Palo Alto's projects were selected for funding to provide the final design. It is not a done deal yet. It has to go through the legislature, and I understand that our council members are probably reaching out to our state senators and state representatives to see if we can save that grant or in this program. Finally, the FRA grant is on track. We do have a staff report today on the review of the FRA agreement and recommendation to the council as action item number 1 today. And I'd like to note that we do have a council meeting where this Rail Committee recommendations to the council that was previously made on April 16th will be discussed and acted upon at the June 10th City Council meeting. So it's more for knowledge and awareness to our community as well. And that concludes my staff report. Thank you.
Great. Let me just follow up on a couple of the things that you said. The Caltrain electrification events that Caltrain's been conducting up and down the corridor. Caltrain agreed to push ours out so that it could be a more thorough event. And so it'll be in all likelihood, late September, right before the actual full launch of the electrified trains. They're actually starting to run on the corridor and debugging them as we go, but that'll be the complete crossover date. And then, as Ripon mentioned, the $23 million that we had received and actually awarded a grant from the state under what's called TIRCIP funds, which come out of the state cap and trade dollars. They were for advancing the engineering design, going into engineering design, which we actually haven't done yet, on our grade separations. And the governor has proposed to zero out those dollars. That includes not only ours, but Mountain View's funding from that same program for Rengstorff, which they were scheduled to break ground on in 2026. So they're ahead of us by quite a bit. And even Burlingame that was scheduled to break ground in 2025, and they were scheduled to receive $70 million. So the different cities and the agencies are actually now pushing the legislature, because the governor proposes his budget and then the legislature comes back with what they decide upon, to rather than have those funds eliminated, but instead to delay them, perhaps a year or whatever. We actually have more time than the other two cities. And in a way, we were having our process accelerated. We're trying to cram in a decision to narrow our alternatives at the Charleston East Meadow location by June, so that we could stay on track for those funds, because we have to have it down to a primary and a secondary preferred alternative. So even if we do get the funds restored, in all likelihood, that deadline has been moved back for us. And so we'll be able to still focus on that, but we probably don't have the necessity of making a decision on June 10th. And so the council and this committee are going to need to kind of struggle with the implications of that change. Okay, so that covers those updates. And then we'll now go on to our action items. And the first is review the funding agreement between the City of Palo Alto and the FRA for $6 million grant, and our recommendation for City Council approval. Back to Ripon.
Good afternoon, committee and chair members, Ripon Bhatia. So the FRA agreement is, the city applied for a federal grant in October of 2022, seeking federal assistance towards the preliminary engineering and environmental phase of our project. The city was awarded with $6 million in federal assistance for this phase in June of 2023. Since then, city staff and Federal Railroad Administration staff has been working cooperatively to develop a funding agreement. And the funding agreement allows for the terms that includes the timeline, budget, and the scope of the project. The scope of the project is in line with the original application, which has a preliminary engineering and environmental analysis for Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston Road crossings. And the $6 million were awarded with a match of $14 million coming from VTA grade separation railroad funds. Those are Measure B grade separation for the City of Palo Alto funds. So city is proceeding forward with anticipating that council will forward these project into the preliminary engineering and environmental phase and utilize this $6 million. The anticipated timeline to do this project is from 3 years. We are expecting that that on June 10th, the council will review this agreement based on the recommendations of Rail Committee, and FRA is expected to execute this agreement in July. And that concludes my staff report. Thanks.
Before we discuss among colleagues, any members of the public who want to speak on this item?
No, not on item one.
Okay. And colleagues, any,
I apologize, Chair Burt, someone just raised their hand.
okay,
So our first speaker is Ruby C.
Yes. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much, council members. My name is Ruby Castillo, and I live at the very corner of Kellogg and Alma. Yeah.
Ruby, I think you're going to want to speak on item number 2.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But we'll put you down for that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Correct, no other speakers.
Thanks. Okay, so back to the committee. We have our staff recommendation and discussion.
Is the 14 million sort of matching still committed? That's not state, so we're okay with that, right?
That is correct. We do have and we are getting into an agreement with, working on an agreement with VTA. It is already appropriated for City of Palo Alto in their budget.
Yeah, this 8 million is even more critical after we heard from the state, so I'm good.
Well, and we'll hear in a little bit the update on the cost estimates, which kind of blow all the other considerations out of the water. All right. So then in that case, we
Chair
need, oh, yes.
One question. You said that this work would take 3 years, so this would be, it would take 3 years to get us to 15% engineering if we completed this work?
No, it's preliminary engineering will be up to 35%.
Okay.
So, and then also environmental clearance. So both preliminary engineering and environmental clearance.
So we could apply to any phase we choose at that, within those.
So yes, typically you would do preliminary engineering to a level of, satisfaction of, to a good level of detail. And then we could start environmental studies and other reviews concurrently, and then finish up 35% preliminary engineering design and finalize our environmental certifications.
You know, I think that's actually helpful in the subsequent context is that where we are even on Charleston East Meadow is we're at a conceptual design, and then we'd go into preliminary engineering, whatever percent that is, 15% or 5%. I'm not sure what.
So we will have like another like a stop at 15% to bring it back to the rail committee and the council, where we would seek their approvals and then move into the final design, final phase of the preliminary engineering design.
Which would take us up to a 30%.
35%.
35%, excuse me. Okay. Then do we have a motion to approve the staff recommendation?
So move.
Second.
Okay. And we had no other comments on that, so all in favor? Aye. That passes unanimously. All right. Now we'll go on to our more substantive discussion. Item number 2, which is to review updated materials for Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston Road grade crossings. And I'll just say that staff asked me to provide kind of some contextual comments to help frame all the details that Rippon's going to provide for us, which are many. And so first I want to say that I know we have a lot of new faces here. We've had people who have been involved with this process for years, but now we have a bunch of folks who are engaging because of concerns over property potential impacts. And we've recognized throughout this 6-year, 7-year process that any property impact is a big deal to any resident who's impacted, and even traumatic. But just to clarify, we are not at a stage where any determinations have been made. What we have is a conceptual design that has potentially certain properties that are impacted, and that's understandable that people would be concerned with that. But I just wanted to make sure everybody understands where we are in the process. And back in 2021, actually the council, after the XCAP committee, which was the citizen and stakeholder advisory committee that worked over 2 or 3 years on narrowing down these alternatives, at Churchill, the committee came up with a partial underpass as a preferred alternative, and the council selected as a preferred alternative, in large part because it had significantly less property impacts than the typical full underpass that is done at most grade crossings today up and down the corridor. At the same time, in 2021, the council actually determined that the South Palo Alto grade crossings were the higher priority, really primarily because there are no grade separations at rail crossings in all of South Palo Alto, and the need is greater there. In addition, even though it's not an easy design there either, there's a greater Caltrain right-of-way than at the Churchill location, which further compounds the difficulty of every alternative that was studied. There are no, unfortunately, we have gone back and forth, and there are no panaceas to this. The council has also prioritized a bicycle and pedestrian separate crossing in the vicinity of Loma Verde, so in South Palo Alto, that we're hoping will be able to be constructed before the Charleston East Meadow project even begins, so that bikes and pedestrians will have that additional crossing, even though the intention is that Charleston and Meadow would still allow bikes and peds to get through during construction. But we don't have those designs. That's an intention. And then, as was mentioned earlier, we've kind of had an acceleration in our focus in the last 6 months, in large part because the federal funding grant, or excuse me, the state funding grant that we were just saying the governor has pulled back, had a deadline associated with it. So we have a little more breathing room on that. But that was still, the intention was to focus primarily on Charleston and East Meadow because that's the one that we think we're going to do first. On top of that, we've had over the last now year and a half a dimension of having Caltrain review our conceptual plans. And when those plans were adopted, we didn't have Caltrain's review yet, in part because we had to take it to a certain point ourselves to submit to them, in part because Caltrain was updating what are called their technical and design standards. And so last year we submitted and then received from Caltrain an analysis, and their standards initially had significant impacts on what we were hoping to be able to do at each of these locations. We've now gone back and forth in a pretty collaborative relationship with Caltrain to kind of narrow those differences, because some of what their technical standards said we couldn't do were things that we wanted to be able to do, less impactful projects. We're moving forward. We've actually resolved a lot of those, but not all of them. And in the end, some of these decisions may need to be made at the Caltrain board level when they are willing to make exceptions for a city that is outside of their kind of their standard rules. That's where we are on the timing right now. We're still in that back and forth with Caltrain, but we're narrowing those and have developed a good working relationship and have actually contracted with them to review these designs that we had at the conceptual level. And then the other thing is that while all this process has been going on, at the beginning, the need for these grade separations was considered to be fairly urgent based upon Caltrain's business plan. We had all this growth in our region. Caltrain was electrifying and planning on going from, at rush hours, they essentially were 5.5 trains an hour, planning to go up to 8, and the possibility of going to 10 or even more trains an hour if high-speed rail ever came on the corridor. They also had to figure out where they'd put passing tracks. So because they took $250 million in funding from high-speed rail, but in exchange for that, they have to accommodate for the possibility that high-speed rail would share these tracks at some date in the future, even though there's a lot of skepticism whether that will ever happen. They've recently narrowed that down, and it's basically south of Churchill. And so that kind of meant that we didn't have to everywhere be anticipating the possibility of 4 tracks. It narrowed it down to a more defined area, really somewhat in between our projects. So what's happened though since COVID is that all the major transit agencies, especially the fixed rail transit agencies, have seen their ridership very much impacted as a result of the changes in work patterns. And Caltrain's only back up to about 40% of their pre-COVID ridership, in large part because Caltrain was kind of exceptional nationally. They had some of the highest, what's called fare box recovery, money that they got for running their operation off of people who rode the train. They had high income people who were tech workers and were taking the train, not because they had to, not because it was the only transportation they had, but because it was a better choice for them. And so Caltrain actually got hit harder than almost any agency. Caltrain and BART and a few others have been particularly hard hit. What all that means is that the time frame in which Caltrain would need to increase the number of trains, which is what was triggering the need for grade separations, in that if we didn't grade separate, we could have gridlock in our community. That's all been pushed back. Not only is the timing pushed back, but we don't yet know what the future will really be, whether it'll ever get up to what they were projecting 5 years ago. Problem is, they haven't revised their business plan. I'm on the Caltrain board and been pushing them to do that. They're going to commence that next year, where they'll do a fundamental revisit and try to project their long-term needs. It's likely that they're going to dial back those needs, but we don't know what that is yet. So that's also, aside from all the funding things, the urgency to accomplish grade separations as a result of what would be gridlock if we didn't, has diminished. None of us know diminished by how much, but pretty significantly. If you couple that with, now we're going to hear shortly from Ripon an update on the cost estimates, which were done several years ago. The construction costs on all major transit projects have gone through the roof, essentially about doubled in the last 4 years throughout the region. And we as an agency or as a city are receiving around $400 million from VTA from the 2016 Measure B sales tax bond. We negotiated really hard to get a share for the cities from Sunnyvale to Palo Alto, and did so. Those dollars look like they were bigger dollars before we got this update that we're going to have shortly. And so the ability to spread our dollars across, we had already made a decision that Palo Alto Avenue would be set aside, in part because there weren't enough dollars to address that. We're now going to be facing an even more constrained ability to fund all 3 of the grade separations we've been looking at. And as I said before, the council in 2021 had said Churchill's the lower priority, not the higher priority. So council hasn't made a decision on what ultimately would happen to Churchill, but for a variety of reasons, the urgency is certainly reduced. We're concentrating on Charleston and East Meadow, and the funding will be a greater challenge. Yeah, it was always going to be a challenge. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit more on the property impacts. As I mentioned, we're at a conceptual design. That is not an engineering design. We don't know what will be the property impacts, but what the council had set as a priority for all of the designs is absolutely to minimize what we would have in property impacts. And so we had the conceptual designs, that intention to minimize, which means minimizing the number of properties impacted and minimizing the degree to which they're impacted. Both of those things remain on the table and would be what is going forward as we move forward on the actual engineering design. So Philip will provide some additional information on that and really to clarify what are some misconceptions about what are the current where we are and what are the current potential impacts. And on top of that, within that, as I spoke about going forward, the engineering design, there are a number of ways that are on the table that potentially will be able to actually reduce those impacts. We have to go through the process of the engineering design, negotiation with Caltrain and all those things to achieve that. But that's what's on the table. And then staff will also give some updates on in any occasion where there are property acquisitions, and people tend to use the term eminent domain, but eminent domain is not commonly used. When properties are acquired for public projects, it's vast majority of time through negotiation of fair market value. And then there are actually tax benefits on both property and capital gains tax to property owners. Those are things we want to avoid, but I just want to make sure people understand those things. We, as a city, can't be the tax advisors to individuals. So the city can only provide limited information, but a lot of that is out there in the public record as far as what those laws are. And we'll be able to provide some information today. So I think that covers my comments, and Ripon, go for it.
Thank you, Chair, for having that preface and setting. So if City Clerk can pull up the presentation, please.
Yeah, you just pull closer.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? All right. Thank you, Chair Burt and members of the committee, Ripon Bhatia again with City of Palo Alto. Also tonight, I have Peter DiStefano from AECom and Millet Littlizinger from AECom, who are our design consultants, preparing the concept plans and helping us in the project. So, but just a brief agenda that we will be going over the purpose and background of the project, provide some information on the project planning, the things that next steps that we need to do. Also provide an present and share the updated plan, profiles, and renderings that we have now updated since the last meeting. And these updated plans reflect some major the comments that were made by Caltrain and other stakeholders during the technical reviews. And we'll also share our next steps for our project. Next slide, please. So the main purpose of our project today is to review these updated grade separation materials that we have available. And just like to note that the City Council just awarded the amendment on May 6th. So these updates are very recent and therefore are available today for to the audience as well as to the committee. And you know, we would like to highlight some of these changes that have been done over the last few weeks. Next slide, please. For the benefit of our audience, I know we have a lot of new faces and we have been contacted by several residents in the project vicinity about the project. So the objective here is to share some of the background and perspective of the history on the project. The project has been ongoing, like Chair mentioned earlier, about 10 years now. And then the project had to go through like community advisory panel and extended community advisory panel through the review processes of these different alternatives that were prepared. Heavy community involvement was there, and they helped us design some of these underpass alternatives, came up with these ideas which were refined further by our consultants. And we have got extensive feedback and input from our community in refining those alternatives. City Council in August and November of 2021 reviewed these recommendations from the extended community advisory panel and the concept plans, and selected preferred alternative for Churchill Avenue as a partial underpass. And for Meadow and Charleston alternative, City Council selected 3 alternatives to be considered further for more studies and refinements, and to be brought back to the Rail Committee for discussions and reviews, so that the Rail Committee can make recommendations to the City Council for proceeding forward with the preferred alternatives. Rail Committee has since then been reviewing several updates, including feedback and input from our stakeholders like Payback, PAUSD, Stanford, community involved, engineers who were involved in the original design, also our community feedback and other through these meetings and input that we received. We conducted some additional studies like geotechnical reports for the soil subsurface conditions. We looked at the sustainability activities like storm runoff. We also looked at the heat island effect, shadow analysis that were concerns from our community, and in making a decision or more informed analysis for Rail Committee to make the selection of the preferred alternatives. In addition, like Chair mentioned earlier, that Caltrain was also involved in the technical analysis. They were previously not preview to these reviews, and so we got their feedback not just only on the project alternatives. We also had requested them to look into the 4 tracking areas and limit those areas within Palo Alto. We also had them look into the standards that they had previously developed to review for more current conditions, and see if there could be some leeway in giving variances or adjustments for our projects. All those analysis required them to do an additional corridor strategy, and they looked into all those requests from the city along the entire corridor and helped us evaluate our plans and gave us some significant feedback and comments. Next slide, please. So I like to note that, even though a lot of work has been done over the last several years, we are still in the very early stage of this project development. We are kind of looking at the concept plans, which is like developing a very early plan to understand the scope, cost, and alternatives to get into the next level of details and secure funding, so that we could request and secure funding for these next phases, understand the impacts of those projects, so that the council can make a decision and get us into a stage where we can make a informed decision into the conceptual design, from the conceptual design into the preliminary engineering phase, and then into the final design, and then it goes into the construction. But even in those steps, each steps would require a laborious work in doing detailed studies for each of the elements, structural, rail, safety, geotechnical, constructability, all those elements will be reviewed at each of those stage and then proceeded forward. So this slide shows that we are at the very early, like the first step of the finish line in this project development phase. Next slide, please. And in this phase, the planning for our project is just to get into this next phase for preliminary engineering and environmental, where we can develop some more details. We can look into the properties impacts and more carefully. Right now, we don't have any topographic surveys. We do not have any property boundary lines. We are kind of putting that based on very preliminary and aerial information that's available. So the project go into the preliminary engineering phase will allow us to do some of those more detailed design. The second thing I like to note is that this is a starting point from where we would be looking at refining further to reduce any impacts to the properties. Like Chair mentioned earlier, the City Council has already directed staff to reduce impacts onto the properties. And that is one of the intent in the preliminary engineering phase, to get the design in a more accurate details and get into more work to look into how we can refine it and reduce those impacts onto those properties, and not just the reduce impacts, but maybe eliminate the number of properties from having those right-of-way impacts. Next slide, please. So council in their evaluation looks into like several factors as as the committee members and the community has been involved during this XCAP and also during the rail committee's review. We can see that there are so many different factors, and all those factors are looked at from the perspective of the project and its impacts on our community in order for council to make the decision in selecting the preferred alternative. So and like to note that some of those factors include traffic circulation, bike and pedestrian circulation, right-of-way minimization, access to neighborhoods, construction impacts, visual changes, cost. All those factors are make it a difficult decision for council, and those are factors which we are helping bring in the comparisons, or the information regarding those project details in to the council, so that they can have a decision, understand the impacts in more details for the decision making. Next slide, please. Like I mentioned earlier, the City Council has already at the November 21st, November meeting and August meeting in 2021 has selected Churchill Avenue as a preferred alternative for partial underpass alternative as a locally preferred alternative. They also included closure as a backup but the preferred alternative was also selected by the council. For Meadow Charleston, the three alternatives were selected to be reviewed further, which was trench, hybrid, and underpass alternatives. And Rail Committee had all consider as the staff to look into viaduct alternative in lieu of the trench alternatives because of the feedback and information that we got from Caltrain. Next slide, please. So the project has gone through various iterations with input and feedback from a community, Payback, Stanford, community, bicycle and pedestrian advocates. They recommended to make improvements on our partial underpass and underpass alternatives that led to adding buffer zones between vehicular and bicycle pedestrian facilities as a safety measure. It also recommended to reduce lane widths, and improve pedestrian and bicycle facilities, including maneuverability and circulation for the bikes and pedestrians. Next slide, please. Caltrain also, City Council also asked the staff to engage with Caltrain, and staff brought in Caltrain at different levels of communication with city and county staff coordination group meetings, local policy makers group, coordinations. In addition, we engaged them to bring in a Caltrain corridor strategy project that would review some of the corridor-related standards and concerns that were up and down the corridor for all different projects, and also had a special had an agreement with them to review our project plans and alternatives, and they provided us feedback on those plans. Next slide, please. As part of the review, we also asked them to look into the 4 tracking segments within Palo Alto. Originally, they proposed on the 4 tracking segment that for about 12 miles all the way from San Antonio Station to North Palo Alto. And we had advocated and asked them to review further, study more, and after studying, the final determination or location that they are working towards is the California Avenue Station as a 4 tracking bypass location and 4 tracking between Churchill and Meadow Drive. So we have limited that 4 tracking segment within Palo Alto and are required to accommodate the designs to allow for the 4 tracking for future. Next slide, please. They also provided several technical comments, and some of those major comments related to the vertical clearance and the standards. They had recently updated the Caltrain had updated their standards, and now our projects are required to comply with those newer standards, and therefore we had to review our plans to ensure that our lands could meet those requirements or ask for variance where needed. And some vertical alignments, horizontal alignments, right-of-way encroachment into the Caltrain right-of-way, and 4 tracking segments were looked at. And these plans were looked at from the operational and maintenance point of view to make sure that our future project would comply with the requirements. Next slide, please. Also, council asked the rail committee and staff to look into the preferred crossing location for pedestrians and bicyclists for Churchill partial underpass crossing. The 2 locations that were considered are the Kellogg Avenue crossing and the Seal Avenue crossing. And our bike and ped transportation analysis with feedback from the community and input and outreach with other factors, consideration of other factors, including the existing plans and network connectivity, led to the Seal Avenue being the preferred location, and Rail Committee has endorsed that location for recommendations to the City Council. Next slide, please. Finally, we all understand how the projects, more recently, our community has been engaged on the property impacts. We just like to note that the project is still at very earlier stage of the development, and if we were to look at a 1 to 100, we are at only 5% development stage. So this is very early phase, and the project intention here is to understand the properties that may be involved in those impacts, and recognizing those properties early and having those conversations with the community is the intent. We are being transparent and open in the earlier stage so that people are involved and understand. And the Rail Committee also has directed the staff to reduce those impacts to the properties as we define those design in our next phase of preliminary engineering. So not only, like I mentioned before, it is like our starting point of where those comments, where those impacts are, and we are considering further reduction from this point to see how much we can work to reduce those impacts to those properties. All and some of the comments that I have received from our community also indicated that that the city had not informed about this impacts previously. But I like to note that even back in 2020, when the XCAP meetings were held, and also when in the November of 2021 or August of 2021, when the city council reviewed these alternatives, the city staff had clearly indicated that multiple partial acquisition of residential properties will be required to accommodate these alternatives. So it was brought to the city council awareness and understanding that these underpass alternative at Churchill and also at Meadow and Charleston will have impact partial acquisition, and some for Meadow and Charleston, some full property acquisitions as well. Another concern that we have been hearing from our community is about the eminent domain. And I like to note, like previously mentioned, is that eminent domain is the last step in the right-of-way acquisition process. Typically, we would go through negotiations and work with each property owner to determine the impacts, work on the right-of-way negotiations to make sure that it can be, a workable solution can be found between the project and the homeowners before a city can get into this next phase of this development. So there are several steps between now and for the property negotiations, and eminent domain is typically the last resort and last step, and most cities don't get to that level with most property owners in a major project. Finally, I like to say that in the preliminary engineering phase, there will be development of these alternatives to a further level of detail, and it will be brought back to the rail committee and the city council. So this rail committee and the city council have still in those next phases of development the opportunity to provide feedback, comments, and make any changes to the project. So before we advance these projects into the final design and environmental work. So I like to make note of that one. Next slide, please. We like to note that our project do have both federal and state funding. Typically, these large infrastructure projects do have federal and state fundings involved, and city has to follow through a strict and stringent requirements for real property acquisition processes for the evaluation, as well as the fair market value determination, and in process and negotiations with the property owners, if so required. If the property acquisition is required. So both federal and state regulations will be followed as these fundings are involved in this project as we move forward. If a property needs are determined that the project will need those requirements. So as I mentioned, the grade separation project does have both at CalSTA, which is the TIRSIP funding that we were talking about, is the state funding, and the FRA agreement that the rail committee recommended today is a federal funding, and both federal and state level funding is involved in this project. Next slide, please. We do have some frequently asked questions because community has reached out about several property acquisition questions, and there's so much. There are also certainly high. This is a really highly regulated area, and so we do have some areas, projects that have recently gone through property acquisitions where they have good samples of the process the frequently asked questions that we are sharing here, and these links can provide you with some of those commonly asked questions about the right-of-way acquisition negotiation process. We cannot get into the details of each property owner at this point because we do not have the level of the details, but typically it is done after environmental impact report is completed and or can be done concurrently if Rail Committee or the council so desires. Next slide, please. And now I'll hand it off for technical details on the Churchill partial underpass and the different alternatives updates to Peter DiStefano.
Great. Thank you, Ripon. Good afternoon, Rail Committee members. I'm Peter DiStefano, a civil engineer with AECOM. So on this first slide here, before I dive in, this is a summary of the comments that we received from Caltrain a few months ago. And before I dive in here, I just want to reiterate Rob Bernard's and his team's message about preservation of the Caltrain right-of-way, preservation of the utility of the right-of-way, I should say. Just to summarize briefly, I'm not going to read every bullet here, but basically I want to summarize kind of some of the design changes that we made in the recent weeks. They requested a wider bridge to accommodate a maintenance road, and that's going to be shown on some renderings that we have here on the upcoming slides. So as a result of that, we had to move the retaining wall that's between the tracks and Alma Street. We had to move it a little bit closer to Alma Street. That triggered a longer bridge span to accommodate turning movements for larger vehicles such as buses and fire trucks. And as I said, we got some new renderings on the upcoming slides to show these updates, and this also includes the new vertical clearance requirement by Caltrain of 16 feet 6 inches. Next slide. This is a view looking south. I just want to touch upon the basis of the bridge and road geometry updates. We basically maintained the southbound track where it is today. We went 15 feet off that alignment for the northbound track. And then the edge of deck of the new bridge is 26 feet off of that to accommodate the spacing for the OCS poles and the maintenance road. There's actually a cross section of this shown on an upcoming slide for Meadow. It's the same cross section. The total bridge width is about 55 feet. On previous renderings and exhibits, it was 45 feet. So it's a little bit wider now again to accommodate that maintenance road. And this results in, after all those dimensions are settled, this results in a minor 3-foot encroachment of Alma Street inside the Caltrain right-of-way. So there is still some encroachment, but meeting the Caltrain's requirements, we're relatively comfortable, and I think they've given even verbal concurrence that the geometry looks good. Next slide. This slide here is just a summary of the items we just discussed. I'm not going to go ahead and read all of them, but we could go ahead to the next slide. These are the revised road profiles to accommodate the additional foot of vertical clearance. There's a slight increase in the maximum grades in the project footprint. I could give you those details if you have questions about that later. I want to keep, I do want to keep this presentation moving along because there's almost 40 slides. So I want to keep this as brief as possible. So again, if you have further questions and details about this, feel free to ask. Now, I think these grades are a little bit alarming to some, and I just want to set a reminder here that the pedestrians and bicyclists will not have to navigate these grades since there's a ped bike tunnel currently planned at Seal Avenue. Next slide. These are the revised typical sections. The center column has been added back in due to the longer span that I mentioned before. And due to the tight constraints on Alma Street, the right shoulder now on northbound Alma in the lowered section, that comment there on the upper right. So the shoulder's been reduced to 5 feet. It was previously shown as 8 feet. Next slide. Here's some of the updated 3D renderings. This is looking northwest towards Pally High in the background. This is a pretty good view of the longer span and maintenance road. You could see there on the bridge, kind of shown in that light tan color. The right lane on southbound Alma is proposed to be striped with a 2-foot shoulder next to the retaining wall. Again, the spacing is really tight now with the additional width of that needed for that maintenance road. Next slide. Here's a couple more views of the 3D model. On the left is looking north from Coleridge, and on the right is a view of the Ped Bike Tunnel at Kellogg from Pali High. Next slide. The image on the left is actually a duplicate from the previous slide, and the image on the right is another view looking north, a little bit zoomed in closer to that lower Churchill-Alma intersection. Next slide.
Yeah, Chair, I'd like to note that as part of the city rail committee's recommendations to reduce, we are considering 1-lane option, and we will be reviewing that in our preliminary engineering phase, and see how northbound on Alma Street, north of Coleridge, and see if we believe it from the traffic perspective it would work, but there are other elements associated with the design that we need to be considered. So as part of our preliminary engineering design, that, and also shoulder widths and other encroachments into the Caltrain, we will still be working with Caltrain to see if we can have additional encroachment, if feasible, or by a foot or two, and that might help reduce some of those reductions into the.
And that shoulder width southbound is now only 5 feet. That's what
That's
they,
actually the northbound. It's in the lowered section. If we could maybe go back
Oh.
to the previous slide, we could show that real quick. Oh, shoot. No.
Yes.
It's a few slide. I think it's slide 20 or 21. Yeah, there, 22 maybe? Yeah, there it is. So you see that note in the upper right? It says reduce shoulder width to minimize encroachment of Caltrain right away. It's shown as 5 feet now.
that's,
That is
Northbound.
that is northbound.
So the
in the lowered
northbound
section.
through and left lane, that is like in that it goes dips down, but it's in the northbound direction.
Okay.
Because there's not in the northbound direction, there's only 1 lane, so there will be some shoulder to allow for any crippled vehicle to take stay on.
Yeah, there's a few different ways you could lay out the dimension of this. For example, I originally had it laid out with an 11-foot lane next to the wall. And Rippon's like, hey, we really should have some shy distance off the wall. And I agreed. That's probably a better idea than, and then taking that extra 2 feet or 3 feet off of the, what was there was another foot. We gained 3 feet somehow. I forget where the other foot went. But anyway, we adjusted the dimension slightly there.
I just have a technical question, if I may. I'm confused. So northbound Alma in this area, there is both a depressed lane and an upper lane.
That's
Presumably
correct.
the depressed lane is if you're trying to turn
That's-
into, okay,
That's right.
okay.
You got it.
Yeah, I missed that. Okay, thank you.
So we go back to slide 26, I think is where we left off. The property impacts. Yeah, this is a graphic summary of the property impacts, and there's really nothing new to report here. The curb line that we showed at the previous meeting along those homes on Alma Street has not been moved. We kept that where it was before. And this results in 15 partial acquisitions between Melville and Lowell, as you can see here indicated in the yellow highlighted color. That's it for the presentation on Churchill. Was there any questions on that before we move to Meadow? All right, next slide. All right, so as we did at Churchill, the bridge is slightly wider to accommodate the maintenance road on the Alma side of the tracks. And due to the jogs in the right of way at this location, Caltrain requested that the tracks be shifted slightly to the west. Again, this is related to preservation of the right of way and the alignment for the 4 tracks just north of here. So we made those revisions. And then these revisions also include that 1 foot additional vertical clearance that we mentioned before at Churchill. That applies everywhere. That 16 feet, 6 inch new requirement. Next slide. Again, this is just a summary of the Caltrain comments with the view looking south, with some of the points made previously. And we have some renderings here to share. Next slide. Yeah, this is just a slide summarizing the revisions that we made. Discussed that already. Next slide. These are the profile revisions we made to accommodate the new vertical clearance. There were some adjustments even made to the pedestrian and bike vertical clearances. There was some improvement made there as well. I think that's noted. Yeah, that's noted. The ribbon has got that noted there on that slide. Next slide. Yeah, here's the typical section of the railroad bridge that I was mentioning earlier. These are the same dimensions used at Churchill. It's got a total width of, I think that's text a little hard to read. I think it's 54.5. So you can see there that 12-foot width is for the maintenance road on the left, and the 13-foot spacing from the pole to the center of the northbound track, 15-foot spacing to the southbound track, and then 12.5. Yeah, the cross section on the lower right. Okay, next slide. Here's some renderings. This is a view looking southeast from Park Boulevard. We found a slight error on this and that we're currently looking to update before the June City Council meeting. The maintenance road here is shown on the west side of the tracks. It should be shown on the east side like it's shown at Churchill. So we'll get that fixed up for the next council meeting. Next slide. The view on the left is looking west. Really no change here from what we presented at previous meetings, except it's hard to see, but in the background is, yeah, exactly. In the background, there's a water bridge. You really can't see too well in this view. And on the right there is, that's a view looking east. So just looking in the opposite direction. Again, the main change here is due to the addition of the maintenance road on the railroad bridge. There is just a very, due to the extra vertical clearance, there's just a very subtle difference in the road profile that you can't even really notice here on these renderings. Next slide. This is a view again for the meadow. This is a view looking north. Again, really no change to the road geometry here. So this shouldn't be anything new on this slide here. Next slide. This is a summary of the property acquisitions. Again, no change here from what you've seen previously. We still have 12 partial acquisitions and two, the partial acquisitions shown in that is, oh yeah, sorry, got confused with the colors. Yeah, it's shown in the yellow color and then the full acquisitions in red. All right, that's all we have at Meadow. Should we move on to Charleston? All right, let's do it. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is essentially a carbon copy of Meadow. Again, there's a shift of the tracks to the west slightly and a wider bridge to accommodate the maintenance road. These changes, as I mentioned before, they show the new vertical clearance requirement by Caltrain. Next slide. Here's a view looking south of the revisions that we just talked about. Next slide. This is a summary of the revisions in the plan view exhibit. Next slide. And this is just an overall view of the project. At this 10,000 foot level, there's really not a noticeable change. Next slide. These are the updated road profiles. The length of the Charleston profile increased just a very small amount. Same at Meadow, it just increased a small amount, I think by about 2% from about 710 feet to about 725. I was a little surprised that it wasn't more significant than that, but that's what it came to. Next slide. These are the typical section of Charleston. Again, no change here. This is what has been presented before at previous meetings. Next slide. Here's an updated rendering looking northeast from Park Boulevard. And again, I apologize, the same we have in Meadow. We have the maintenance road shown on the wrong side of the track, so that will get cleaned up for the next meeting. Next slide. This is a view looking southeast from Park. Again, you can see the wider railroad bridge there in the middle of the screen. Next slide. View on the left, that's looking west, and view on the right is an aerial also looking west. This is a summary of the property acquisitions on the west side of the tracks. No changes here. We got 8 partial acquisitions and 1 full acquisition there on the corner. Yeah, on the north of Meadow, just the intersection of Park and Meadow. And these, thank you. These are the partial summary of the partial. Summary of the acquisitions on the east side of the tracks. There's actually 2. There were 2 minor acquisitions that we didn't include before near the roundabout. That's shown at 228 and 272 Charleston. So now there's 22 total, 22 partial acquisitions total. 12 on this. 22 partial acquisitions on this side of the tracks. My apologies. 12 on the north side and 10 on the south side. And again, we have the two full acquisitions there for the roundabout. Okay. Next slide. We're going to talk about the Meadow Charleston hybrid.
Could you just do me a favor and add up the total and fulls for Charleston? I know
Yeah.
you presented them as.
At Charleston, I believe there's 30 partial. There's 8 on the west, 22 on the east, and 3 full acquisitions total. 1 on the west, 2 on the east. Okay. Due to the jog here in the right of way, shown here in yellow at Meadow, again, Caltrain is proposing a shift of the tracks to the west as we described before. Next slide. Again, this is just an overview of Caltrain's comments for the Meadow Charleston hybrid here at Meadow. And similar to the Meadow Charleston underpass, we revised the design to accommodate shift of the tracks, the maintenance road, and the new vertical clearance requirement. I wanted to make note of something that really needs to be described here. The previous versions of these renderings and exhibits show the retaining walls located on each side of the track about 15 feet from the center of the track. So this updated version, again, based on the Caltrain's comments, they requested the east wall, that's the wall that abuts up against Alma Street. They want that wall on the right-of-way line. And they want the embankment built up all the way to that wall to use that space for potential siding or what have you, whatever they want to use it for. So I think when you see these renderings coming up soon, it's going to probably look as a little of a shock to you, but that's the reason why. And then the wall on the other side, on the west side, on the Park Boulevard side, that wall is set 10 feet off of the right-of-way line, and they want that 10 feet of space for maintenance access. Okay, next slide. These are an overview of the similar comments at Charleston. Again, I'm not going to go through each and every one, but very similar to what was described previously at Meadow. There's one subtle difference worth pointing out here at Charleston is that there'll be some encroachment onto Caltrain's right-of-way that's shown there, like the red hatching for the southbound right turn lane from Alma onto Charleston. That essentially mimics the existing condition. Next slide. Here's the summary of the design revisions at Meadow. Next slide. And the road profile revisions at Meadow. We actually took the liberty of trying to improve since we had to revise this anyway for the vertical clearance, we to try to reduce the profile limits. So actually the profile limits were reduced from what we showed previously.
Peter, just for any folks who are unfamiliar with what we mean by a hybrid, maybe we better explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So hybrid is what we mean by partially raising the tracks in elevation and partially lowering the road in elevation to achieve that 16-foot, 6-inch vertical clearance. There's many hybrids along the Caltrain corridor. Holly Street is one. Britain, I believe, as well. I think the 25th Avenue one recently constructed is also a hybrid.
But when we say partially, we need to make sure everybody understands. So it's an earthen wall is the intention,
Mhm.
and it would be how much would we be lowering the road and how much would we be raising the track?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question because hybrids could have each hybrid is not all created equal. So in this case, I believe the raise in the rail here is about 15 to 17 feet on the order of that. And the road is getting lowered looks like about 6, 7 feet. I'm just trying, maybe not even. Is it 6 feet? Okay, 6 feet.
There's 6 and 14, so it makes 20.
Yeah, I think it was originally that, but the structure depth went up, so it's a little more than 20 difference. Yeah, but it's on the order of those numbers. Okay, next slide. Here are some updated renderings for this alternative, and this is kind of what I meant by a little bit shocking to see the first time, because you see this wide expanse of embankment with nothing there, but that was based on the Caltrain's comments to have the wall built up right against the right of way. Next slide, thank you. On the left, this is a view looking west, and on the right, that's a view looking east on Meadow towards the bridge. Next slide. Here's an aerial view looking north at the Alma Meadow intersection. And again, can you go back to that slide real quick? Again, sorry. Yes, on this rendering in 3D model, they actually have the maintenance road on the correct side, so this one is shown correctly. So we're good there. Sorry, next slide. Yeah, this is just a summary of the design revisions here for the Meadow Charleston hybrid at Charleston Road. Next slide. And these are the revised profiles, road profiles of Alma and Charleston. Oh, I didn't realize we hit. Yeah, one more slide. Yeah, this is just a rendering this is looking south at Charleston. Again, with the wider bridge for the maintenance road. Charleston, again, similar renderings that we had at Meadow, looking west on the left and looking east on the lower right. And this is just an aerial view looking towards the northwest, towards Park Boulevard. All right, and I'll hand this over to Ripon.
All right, so we did the Dale Committee and the council also wanted us to look into the costs, and since the last update was from 2018 costs based on 2025 estimates with 3% inflation from 2018 to 2025. So those costs, the previous estimates and the previous ranges are in the first two columns. AECOM helped us in looking at those costs for the more recent numbers based on the more recent estimates and developed a cost estimate. And those costs are in 2024 column, which is current day cost based on the current estimates and the current bidding environment. We noticed that it's up from anywhere from 50 to 60% for alternatives, which is actually in line with most other cities that are finding out in the recent bid environments that the costs have gone up that about 40 to 70% up in general for the projects that were bid from their engineer estimates. And every column therefore thereafter shows a 4% increase. We have assumed 4% inflation rate for the next 7 years. And then the 2031 is our earliest construction feasibility if we are on expedited and funding is no constraint and if everything goes well. And that would be the estimates for 2031. And I like to note that in the last column where it's increased by the last, for Charleston and hybrid, those numbers were transposed. So actually the hybrid is 107% increase and Meadow Charleston underpass is 102% increase. And that some of that cost is associated with that increased elements that are added based on the comments from Caltrain. Also for the Churchill partial underpass, I like to note that the cost is went up by 61%. And the reason for that is that we did the preliminary engineering, preliminary geotechnical studies, and we found that the water tables were lower than what we previously assumed. So we do not need dewatering during the construction, as well as the cutoff walls will not be needed, and those are very expensive and huge items, and so those were taken out of the cost, and that resulted in a savings and overall lesser price increase for that alternative. Next slide, please.
Could we ask some questions on that cost slide?
Sure.
Could I start, Chair, since I started? Sorry. I'll take your last comment and move back from that. When you talked about 2031, I think you said that's the first feasible date that we could start construction. Is that what you said?
That's true.
Okay, so does that mean all of these preliminary numbers are basically irrelevant because it's now going to cost at least 436?
Correct.
Okay,
But
that
you
would
know,
be
like a lot
shorter
of time
slide.
people don't see that like, oh, 107% increase. I like to show that it is 50% increase just because of the cost of inflation from 2024 to 2031.
Right. And then the next question is, what's included in that? Is that just the construction costs starting at what? Or does that include engineering costs and?
It's the entire project cost.
Yeah, it includes everything under the sun, escalation, contingencies, support costs, engineering, environmental,
But not previous costs.
even,
Correct.
Previous costs as well? I mean, money that we paid consultants?
no,
Okay.
no, it's moving forward from here.
Final design.
Yeah.
for it.
It even includes flagging for Caltrain. I forget the number now, but it's significant.
Okay. Those are my two main questions.
And just the date on the previous estimate was what?
It was 2018 cost estimates based on and actually it's 2025 projected. So those numbers 210 to 380, 450 and 180 was 2025.
Okay.
Question. So but does this include, for example, box jacking? So this is just a straight escalation of what we had, plus any alterations to the bridge depth and kind of the minor tweaks that
Right.
Peter highlighted in his presentation. But for example, for the underpass, does not include what happens if we box jack instead of having the electrified shoe fly tracks.
That's right. All these estimates include an assumed shoe fly, because the box jacking, even though it's feasible, that has a ripple effect with other costs.
Mhm.
Like we may have to lower the road even further if we do box jacking, so we'd save on shoe fly potentially, but it's gonna incur other costs.
Right.
So we haven't delved into that in detail yet.
So it's fair to say that once we get to the 15% engineering, these numbers can still move a lot anyway, besides inflation in life, because you will start to have more clarity on whether box jacking would change things or whether.
Yeah, I would say if Caltrain insisted on box jacking, it conceivably could even increase.
Okay.
Again, we don't have that answer right now.
Sorry. Finally, we'd like to note that at April meeting, rail committee meeting, the rail committee had recommended to move forward with seal as a preferred crossing for partial underpass at Churchill Avenue. And for Meadow and Charleston, Rail Committee recommended to move forward with underpass and hybrid alternative towards to advance into preliminary engineering and environmental phase. And also further directed to reduce property impacts and optimize bicycle and pedestrian facilities, and look into the traffic circle and construction impacts for Charleston also. So more specific requirement directions on further refinements as we get into the preliminary engineering phase. Next slide, please. Finally, the next steps is to get to the city council on June 10th and seek their review and direction on proceeding forward with a preferred alternative for Meadow and Charleston, and also for preferred location for pedestrian crossing for Churchill Avenue. And also, in addition to that, the Rail Committee just approved the FRA agreement, and that will be on our horizon for approval from the city council. And that concludes our staff report. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go back to questions from the committee and then go to the members of the public, and then we'll discuss after hearing from the public. Any questions on any of the other slides, technical issues? Julie?
Yeah, thank you, Pat. Thank you very much for your presentation. Really complicated, and I know for those of you who've been at this for years, it's, there's a lot of shorthand here. And for, I think, some members of the public who are engaging newly or relatively newly with this material, there's a lot of acronyms and a lot of information. Just want to acknowledge it's a lot. But thank you for walking us through it as expeditiously as possible today. My technical question is with regard to the hybrid slides. They came following the underpass slides. So first we saw Charleston or Meadow Charleston underpass, then we went to Meadow Charleston hybrid. There were not slides on hybrid property acquisitions. Can we draw the conclusion that there are no property full or partial takings, acquisitions associated with the hybrid options?
That's correct. There are no acquisitions, although there'll probably be some construction easements for driveway modifications. But I mean, we're essentially trying to keep the existing condition as is, just lowering the road slightly.
And when you say construction easement impacting driveways, is that only during the construction phase or is that permanent?
It'll be a permanent impact. So for example, the apartment building near Meadow, what's that, on the east side of Meadow? So those driveways may have to get lowered slightly. So they may have steeper grades going into their carports. I don't know if you're familiar with the the underpass at Holly Street in San Carlos.
I am. I used to live there.
Yep. So like in the gas station, you could see the road has been lowered. You see these short retaining walls. So those driveways, for example, were modified from the original condition.
Thank you. As a technical matter, can you explain why a property such as 4097 Park, which is considered a full property acquisition under the Meadow underpass alternative, help us understand what necessitates a full property acquisition as opposed to a working with that property owner to somehow reduce that footprint? Help
Gotcha.
us understand
Yeah.
why it becomes that.
Yeah, if it's possible, we could go to that slide. I think it would help everyone understand if we could see if I can give you the slide number. I think it's slide 36. If you just type in 36 and hit enter. Thank you. So originally, when this was laid out, this was not considered a full acquisition at that parcel that you're referring to. But it required some acquisition of the parcel on the south side of Meadow. So it was almost like a little bit of each parcel. But we knew with this alternative that we were going to have to acquire that apartment building because the road is so much lower. The road is so much lower at that apartment building that we can't regrade the driveways there. So there was a comment, I want to say a couple of years ago, to realign Meadow to the north. It's like, okay, we're gonna try to minimize any impacts to the south side. So that's why the north side was chosen, because of that apartment building. So there's a little bit of history there with the design. So it's a little bit subtle, but there's like an S curve with Meadow here. It's not straight. So it was a subtle engineering change we made, I want to say like in 2021 or 2022. That was the rationale behind that.
So the 4097 home on the south, on the
Four
West
zero is on the
side.
north side.
I'm looking at
4097.
4097 west.
Yes, it's on the west side, on the north side of Meadow, right?
That's the piece I'm asking about.
Yes. So the alignment got shifted closer to that home to avoid or minimize the impacts to the south side of Meadow.
To the homes on the south side of Meadow?
That's right.
So Councilmember, typically when a property structure is kind of in the right of way, then we would look into a more like that is not gonna be a partial take. It's gonna impact the livability of that resident, and therefore a full property acquisition would be required. And I like to note that this one will be further refined, but it's less expected that for partial underpass, that total property take will be eliminated from that one. So it will be full take expected for that, full property acquisition.
Thank you. And I think I'm trying to ask probably a simpler question. And I didn't articulate it well at the front end. It's going to just, the way the road has to curve, the way Park will be impacted and the way Meadow will be impacted will be such that a portion of this home's yard and the home itself are just necessarily caught up in the geometry of it. And so there's no other option. I'm trying to help people understand.
I wouldn't say there's no other option, because
Okay,
the original layout took a little bit of each parcel at that corner. I can't read the number. It's 4097, and what's the one across the street? 4101? So we originally laid it out so there was acquisition, a partial acquisition on each side. But the idea was, if we could shift Meadow to the north, I don't want to say sacrifice, but I mean, that was just the way it worked out, that home was considered an acquisition so that we could minimize all the other partial acquisitions on the south side. Again, that's not the only way to do this. That's not the only solution.
Yeah, and if I might just follow up on that, for example, on the south side of Meadow, that's the bike and ped path, right?
Right.
And that width is currently designed as what?
I think it's 20.
Yeah.
Well, the lowered path is 20 feet, yes.
Yeah. So that is not necessarily the width that we have to come up with. So
Correct.
that's another dial that could be turned.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do believe this is a technical question, but stop me if it feels more like a comment. We are seeing in this presentation that hybrid, as opposed to Meadow Charleston, hybrid has no takings, acquisitions. And underpass does. For people personally impacted, it would seem then that hybrid would be more attractive. The expenses slide also showed it was the least expensive. So can you help us understand? Because I know it's not this simple. Help people understand, despite the fact that there are no acquisitions and it appears to be the least expensive based on our best estimates right now. What are the downsides associated with hybrid?
Sure.
Such that it is not the clear, obvious option.
I would say the largest downside, maybe Nadia could chime in on this too, because she knows this intimately well as well also, is the hybrid does not grade separate the pedestrian and bicyclist from Alma Street. They still have to cross that busy intersection. So I would say that's the greatest downside.
And to add to that, I was just going to add to that, what it does from a traffic perspective is it leaves those intersections as F intersections in the future. So currently those are, A is a good intersection, F is the worst. We would go through all of this construction, and the hybrid the viaduct and the trench all leave those intersections as Fs. And the underpass improves them to different levels of B, C, D, and E, which if you're a teacher doesn't sound great, but I promise they're better than F. And that's the largest. And from a safety, pedestrian and bike safety perspective, the cars are not, basically, in any of the alternatives except the underpass, pedestrians and bikes will continue to hit the call button, which interrupts the light signal, which interrupts traffic.
Yeah, besides that, the visibility, because there was several comments from community regarding the hybrid being dividing, because it's going to be a big walls on both sides, so visibility and others were concerned. And also for your convenience, council member, there is a matrix that helps look into that more both subjective and objective like all those 11 or 12 council adopted criteria, they compare these alternatives also.
And that's available on the Connecting Palo Alto website somewhere.
Correct.
I'm actually asking this question for people who are listening. I know I've already asked these questions myself, but I think, you know, I'm trying to anticipate some of the questions that may come.
Right.
And so to let people know that this matrix comparison data is available is helpful.
Correct. And also I'd like to note that Connecting Palo Alto website is updated all the way until our last meeting. So this is our newer information, and this information is not yet updated on Connecting Palo Alto, and we'll be updating it next week. These newer plans and things available that we'll be looking at, we will be adding that also.
And one last question, please. It was mentioned that both the number of property acquisitions and the degree of property acquisition are different factors. Can you give us a sense of how we decide whether we want to go, the relative impact of a partial on a home/property owner versus a full? It seems to me, as I think about it, that full is quite different. It requires a relocation. It's an asset that is no longer theirs and so on. Whereas a partial is an encroachment into yard, into view. Can you give us a sense of how they are? I realize that to some extent there's a subjective component here of which is worse or which is better, but I'm imagining there's more of an objective sense from an engineering perspective of, you know, this is why we call this only partial, because it's only this bad.
Let me try to answer that. There is objectively, there is a number, of course, associated with the amount of the property impact, right? So that number is like how much square footage is impacted. But then there's also subjective matters like the fair use of that property. And those both things will get into the right-of-way negotiations acquisition process, that the fair market value of those elements. And so, you know, again, we have to look at on a property by property basis, and that is our next steps. After we do the refinements, we have more confidence level of that the property impacts or the right of way that's needed has been reviewed further and limited and minimized, and this is what it is. And at that point, we will get into this next discussion of what you're recommending of looking into objectively, as well as the other matters that fair use of those properties as well.
And if I could add, we, as engineers, try to avoid the full acquisitions at all costs. In fact, the original concept for the Meadow underpass had a roundabout. There's just not enough room to place it. Charleston had a greater right-of-way width, plus, I don't know if maybe you go to that exhibit, there's a triangular wedge near Mumford that allowed the diameter of the roundabout to fit a little bit better at that location. So that required some backyard acquisitions versus a full acquisition on the north side of Charleston. We still had to do two of the full acquisitions on the south side, but I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, is the design team working with the city? I mean, that's kind of like a last resort, more or less, is the full acquisition.
I appreciate that. I'm trying to, ultimately, we're going to have to weigh the various costs and benefits, and I'm trying to arrive personally at a better understanding of the degree of harm posed by partial versus full, and the extent to which we ask group of people, a part of town, a city, to absorb these impacts, and to fully appreciate them. Okay.
Yeah,
Did-
if I could just expand on what Ripon said, partial acquisition are not created equal. It's not even just the total area either. I mean, some of the acquisitions get somewhat close to the homes. I mean, that's a huge impact. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on with that and not getting too much into the details. And I know this is years down the line, but since this slide is up, that decision you made to split 4101 and whatever the red one is. Okay. I need a new prescription for sure. I presume that, well, first of all, let me say what's going to happen to pick up on what you're saying is that they don't have to make these decisions. 7 of us have to make these decisions, and there's going to be a lot of decisions, potentially 40 different decisions. So as I understand it, they're going to come to us with alternatives. Here's the option, here's the downside of this, here's the upside, and here's the other side. And at some points, you might even get a situation like this where we might say, well, that looks pretty difficult, but why don't you have a discussion with the owners of both of those homes and see which one is more, likely to say, okay, that might be, for the right arrangements, I might be more amenable because I'm okay to move. Whereas someone else doesn't want to move for other reasons. So I say, I don't want to get down there, but that negotiation with multiple parties might be one of the things that we get information on to make decisions on what is optimal.
Council member, I just want like to note that typically that's not the process that the project will require necessitating the right of way needs, not the other way around. That the
Say
right of way-
that again?
The project determines the right of way needs,
No, I get that.
not the negotiations with the property owners or the other way.
I
So
totally get
just
that.
want to make sure that.
What I'm saying is that I'm building on what the chair said is that we may not need as much width there. So that gives us a little bit more. So then it's sort of, well, we need one or the other. We don't really care which because we can make the road work either way. And so then I'm just saying is that there's a lot of things we have to look at. And there's nothing that's automatic here. There's going to be some maybe difficult decisions. We are on record in this committee and on the council as saying, we don't want any, but we have to see if that's possible because we have to get some grade steps in. So whether we're going to get the last 10 that we have to decide on because that's all there's going to be or what, we just don't know yet. But I think it's going to be a difficult process if there are any, but we're going to have to make those calls, the 7 of us. So.
Can we pull up slide 60? And my question is, this now shows the berm, not essentially a 2-track berm, but the entire width of the right of way. Can you refresh us on why the berm is so wide? I know that Caltrain had wanted an access, but that doesn't require that a roadway parallel for maintenance. That doesn't require coming all the way out to Alma. So what's the reasoning on that?
So Caltrain requires the utility of the existing right of way in the permanent conditions. And that requires us to provide them the same elevation for the entire right of way width. That's what they had required. Now we'll have to go back and wrestle with them to ask for less, but this is what that impact would cause.
Okay, so we're taking that as a given because that at this point in time is Caltrain's position. But as we had discussed, there are things that are preferences of Caltrain and actual needs, and I'd put this in the category of a preference. And because when we had first looked at hybrid, it was not going all the way out to Alma, and It's still the impact visually on the community of basically an earthen wall running through, a mile or so of the community that is a big, complete physical divide of dividing the community in half. So that's one of the downsides to that, in addition to the traffic one. So a couple questions back on Churchill. Ripon, can you review I know you had mentioned that there are several ways that we may be able to reduce the roadway width and reduce the impacts, whether it's being able to get a little more intrusion into the Caltrain right away, or a single lane northbound on the outside, albeit with a shoulder that we would have to have. But under the current conceptual design, can you review how much impact there would be on the properties on Alma? We currently have the planting strip. It's city owned, but people have that in front of their homes, and it affects their homes, even though it's a city owned property. Then we have the sidewalk, and then we have whatever intrusion there is on the map on those properties.
If you can pull slide 20, please.
Okay.
That way it's helpful.
I think the typicals are on 22.
22. Okay.
Is that what you want
Yeah.
to see, the typical section?
I was gonna show on the plan. Yeah. So thank you, Chair, for that question. And so currently, as proposed, it shifts the sidewalk back about 4 feet, providing total of 9 feet between face of curb and the back of the walk.
So when you say it shifts it back, so it moved the sidewalk 4 feet into the private properties.
Correct. That's how it is currently proposed, and provides the minimum width of the buffer about 4 feet. That allows for one planting of some trees and
Yeah.
bushes that gives some separation between the homes and the traffic. Second thing, it's also provides the room for undergrounding all the overhead electrical lines and some of the space requirements for those. And so those are some of the reasons. And I also provide safety for northbound. And I think Rail Committee unanimously wanted to see that buffer to have that safety perspective between the bicycle and pedestrian traffic from the northbound traffic that was moving on those.
So it would shrink the planting strip by 6 feet and intrude into the private properties by 4 feet.
That is correct. And Peter, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep, that's correct. And if you want to skip to slide 22, that we have a nice typical section that shows that on the upper right. Is there?
Yep.
There's a way to zoom in
that.
there.
Upper right.
That if you zoom in, you can kind of see where the existing sidewalk is.
Okay.
Actually, that label's hiding the right of way lines. But anyway, you're right, Councilmember Byrd. That it's a shift of the sidewalk 4 feet into, basically a 4 foot shift of the sidewalk. So it's encroaching 4 feet into their property.
Right. And shrinking the planting strip by 6 feet?
Yeah, I
Correct.
think it was the existing 10 feet.
Existing.
Yeah, if existing is 10, we're shrinking it by 6,
So
right?
it's a 4 foot intrusion into the property.
Yep.
Okay. And I think we're hopeful that through some of these other design factors, we may not have that 4 feet. Doesn't mean we wouldn't lose some of the planting strip, but and then you mentioned, Ripon, that we have utilities currently in the planting strip. The assumption we have right now is that we'd actually need to underground those.
Correct.
Which is that's a net benefit in some ways.
And yes, we did hear from some of those fronting property owners that those poles were kind of ugly and.
Oh, everybody has above ground utilities wants to be on the list for undergrounding. Yep. Okay. And then let's see. I think. Yeah, those are my primary questions. So unless anybody has any more, how many speakers do we have?
We have 14 speakers.
Okay. So let me do a time check. We're scheduled to end at what time? 5:30. Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, so we have a hard stop at 5:30. And Ripon, can you review what out of this, we don't need to really provide additional direction to the council for June 10th unless we want to incorporate kind of some of these new developments in our recommendations, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
It isn't one of them I would say the elephant in the room, but the elephant's gone, which is all the money. So doesn't that
Yeah, well,
sort of raise
that's
the
right.
issue of, do we want to look at 3 or go down to 2, or do we want to push some things out for a year? I mean, those are pretty big decisions. So
Yep.
do we want to talk about that today? If so, we need.
Well,
some
we don't
time.
have another opportunity as a rail committee to do that before the council meeting. So yeah, I think we'll at least want to have some preliminary discussion and whether we want to make any recommendations to the council.
Yeah.
Okay.
Chair.
So we need time for that.
When Vice Mayor said 2 or 3, I can relate to that. What exactly was?
On the, I think he's talking about on the Charleston East Meadow alternatives, whether we were intending to narrow it to 2 preferred alternatives. Do we still need to make that decision on June 10th, given what has changed on the TIRSIP funding?
No, that stays correct, but we need to make that decision on June 10th to make sure that we have 1 or 2 only
But
move forward.
if the TIRSIP funding is not driving that, why does that decision still have to be on the 10th?
Actually, the preliminary engineering and environmental per FRA is typically only allowed only on 1 of the alternatives to move
Okay,
forward.
so for the federal funds, we still have the
Correct.
same deadline.
Yes.
Julie?
I was just going to suggest, I know we're having a conversation about what needs to come after public comment and how much time to allocate. And I know we all care to hear what property owners have to say now that they've been alerted that there may be some impacts. So I would be in favor of whatever maximum you're able to give. And, you know, let's try to be as succinct as possible on the back end about discussing the more procedural things.
Well, I think we've got time to allow those 14 members to speak for up to 3 minutes.
And just so you know, Chair, we have 3 more additional requests to speak.
So we're now at 17.
Correct. And we will stop accepting new requests once the first speaker finishes their public comments.
All right. Well,
And our Zoom, next meeting is Zoom offsite, right? So we have to,
so we can just step out and do it from here. Yeah. Okay. So each member of the public can have up to 3 minutes to speak, but any who want to just echo prior statements or anything like that, we'd welcome it so that we can get back to hopefully have enough time for the discussion and recommendations to the council.
So if you want to public speak, just make sure you turn on the microphone. There should be one button and a red light will come on. Give me 1 minute.
Thanks, Christine. So one of the issues that was just brought up, and it's not in my notes, but comparing us to Holly or Britain, when our homes are not a auto parts store or a Home Depot or the dollar store, hurts me. We're a neighborhood, and we're a neighborhood that when I first bought in, it was the affordable street, because you could buy in Alma, across from the train station, train tracks and the whistles and the noise, and you could get your foot in the door of Palo Alto. This alternative came about because a very well-organized, well-funded Southgate didn't want to remove their barriers, and so closing Churchill was not convenient for them, and that's a much more expensive area. So I'm just going to stop with that, but that's how I'm feeling. I went to the XCAP meetings, I went to Lucy Stern Center, many of our neighbors did, and both Greg Tanaka and Lydia Koo were on record of saying, look, we don't want to take homes through eminent domain. That's just not something we will support. That made us feel better. We knew we were going to have the construction noise, the disruption, but we were going to be safe in our homes. This map that was produced for the first time that you're seeing on the screen on April 29th was a shock. Because Greg Tanaka and Lydia Koo, sorry, people I have a lot of faith in, told me it wasn't going to happen. And I went and asked those questions. I'm sorry, I'm emotional. This is a home where I raised my son. It's a multi-generational home. It's a home I'm planning on living in. To say that during in that April 29th meeting, that, and Rippon brought it up, we're repurposing city land. The question was, we rely on that to safely back out, the planning strip to safely back out. And they said, oh no, there'll be a smaller landscaping strip. I spoke to city council members after, and they said, well, what are you talking about, Kathleen? And I said, no, they're repurposing the existing landscaping strip and the sidewalk, and then they're gonna push it up onto our private property. I've asked many people now, are you saying you're only gonna take like 5 feet of our land? Oh no, we're gonna take whatever's necessary to do this. And I'm like, wait a second. And then you're getting rid of a stoplight on Churchill and Alma, so the cars are gonna be zooming by if they can. So you're taking the livability of my house away from me. And it's being done in a way, well, I've lost confidence in my city council. And that's really a shame because I've been here for 25 years. And from my time externing in the city councils, in Ariel Collins, the city attorney's office, where I helped with eminent domain, to being in front of this meeting now, I didn't expect to have it happen. Right now, the planning department has shared that Alma is in a special 24
your
foot
time is up.
setback. You want to do it?
Our next speaker is Helen. And give me one moment, ma'am, and I'll pull up the
Oh.
screen.
Thank you. Just a brief history of the house at the corner of Churchill and Alma. It's 104 years old, and I'm almost that old, 94, but I want to keep up with the house, so I'm motivated to keep up with the garden. The bougainvillea came with the house when I bought it 44 years ago. But the Matalia poppies appeared on their own, and there's such a big competition to the bougainvillea. I liked the red poppies, but I respect the water. I look at the beautiful lawns. I look at beautiful flowers, and my poppies don't even get a drink, and they're sagging. But favoritism, I favor the roses, and they get a little water, but not the rest of the garden. The garden wants to stay. It used to be on Alma, and now I'm finishing, but on Alma, some of the plant, one year I went into bachelor buttons, and some of them are still appearing on their own. 2 years ago, it was lupin, and all of a sudden I didn't plant it, and there it is. The house wants to stay. Don't take it away, please.
Our next speaker is Neva, excuse me.
So I'm continuing from Kathleen. The information which was provided to another neighbor by the planning department includes the following. Alma is a special 24-foot setback area. This means you cannot build any structure within 24 feet of the Alma property line. Certain houses currently have a 20-foot or less front setback. The historic and old homes located on have only a 10-foot setback from Alma, at least 3 of the homes in yellow. Homes along Alma have a 16-foot side street setback. Several homes would have land taken from their side yards. I am now informed that certain of the above will result in a constructional condemnation. So my name is Neva Yarkin. I live on Churchill Avenue, 5 houses from the Alma train tracks. I have been involved in the Palo Alto train issue for many years before today. Now eminent domain is back on the table, and City Council thought that they could just push the eminent domain options through by June 10th. If 15 properties on Alma by Churchill lose part of their front and side yards by eminent domain, will the same happen on Churchill Avenue? Of course it will. Would any of the Southgate citizens who wanted this partial underpass option be willing to give up some of their property for this option? I don't think so. Also, who in their right mind would want any of their property value to be reduced because of eminent domain? On another side issue, Castelleo will be starting their remodel this summer. Construction will go for 3 to 5 years. How will that work with 2 major construction zones happening in the same area of town at the same time? Thank you for your time.
Our next speaker is Brett Reed.
Thank you, members of the Rail Committee and staff, council members, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Brett Hudasic. I am the homeowner of 109 109A Coleridge. We have owned our home for 20 years. We are one of the private properties that could lose up to 20 feet of our property along Alma as described in the preferred Churchill grade separation. My husband and I submitted a letter prior to the meeting today as he could not be here. He is attending a fundraiser for a PAUSD program. The letter highlighted your obligation to exhaust all possible designs that do not take private property. This must be possible. We are also concerned about the environmental considerations, such as the mature trees along Alma in both public and private land that will be lost. The safety aspects of the Alma fronting homes, as well as housing policy. Palo Alto has prioritized and streamlined the process for multifamily housing on this corridor by eliminating design review. City housing policy recognized the Alma corridor as one of the only places in town to maintain and create attainable and affordable housing. Taking private property here, however small, is counter to Palo Alto's stated housing goals. I think you've answered the question I had, and so thank you for your consideration.
Our next speaker is Catherine.
Thank you, council members and Chief. Thank you. Okay. And thank you, Helen, for pointing out that your home is that old. Her setback is 14 feet from the edge of the sidewalk to actually the wall of her home. So our concern, I think I've been the third one to express now, is the lack of transparency. Here we have a report that just came in and is presented to you, presented to us at the same time. And there's been no, we've not been notified any other way previously. Not to mention the level of errors on the presentation that was mailed to Helen recently, I think after, I guess, May 6th. So we do expect a greater dissemination of information to those who would be affected, particularly for Kathleen, whose front door is on this facing Alma, which would be heavily impacted by, we're impacted 14 feet to her front door would be devastating for the value of her home, certainly. The second thing I wanted to bring up is appraisal, and I'm glad some of you have discussed this importance of avoiding eminent domain. But what I'm not seeing, and I think that this has been very rail-centric, north-south centric, and of course very heavily engineered in this presentation, but we're missing the east-west part of Palo Alto where Helen has at that light on occasion 50 to 250 bicyclists per light change at certain times. Not to mention the off hours where a little bit after school or before school where or after the start times where there may be a little bit less, but still hundreds or rather dozens of cyclists and pedestrians. So the underpass, the partial underpass option completely cuts off the whole quadrant from Embarcadero to Oregon Expressway, east-west. So the problem with that is there's going to be a lot more traffic on Embarcadero, which is very dangerous. You have Pali right there. I'm not sure how Sealy became the choice for the bicycle and pedestrian passage, but we're not really seeing how, I mean, the lack of transparency and this avoidance of this, the flow of east-west, the cutting off of a whole section of Palo Alto is reminiscent of what they did 65 years ago in the 60s. We don't need that. We can easily have people move east-west and get to Pali and all the recreation that you have there without diverting everyone around.
Your time is up.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Eric. Yes. Give me a moment, please, to pull them up. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Eric Nordman. I had some comments on the updated plans. Next slide. Could you put it full screen? The Churchill overpass length has dramatically increased. In January, it was shown here on the lower left image with having a 16-foot shoulder, and Caltrans asked why it was so large. It's now much wider, and that's going to make it much more expensive, and it's going to probably preclude jackboxing because you need to assemble the box before you jack it into place. Next slide. If you look at the left-hand image, there's Caltrain pointed out that there's a issue with the merging. You have 3 lanes going into 2, which then becomes 1. Since Alma is now, since there's no light at Churchill, you don't need to have the capacity of 2 lanes. And so it would be alternately, one can move the 1-lane section all the way back to Churchill and avoid the 16 partial property acquisitions. Another option that could be used to mitigate the thing, I think you're already doing some of this, is to reduce the shoulder. It's an 8-foot shoulder. In the previous design, I think you moved it down to 5 or now. It could be 2, and you could also move the pole onto the top of the railing as Caltrain suggested. Next slide. This is a potential tweak to the underpass option at Charleston. And the current design has a U-shaped ramp from the bottom of the bike ped lanes to get up to the sidewalk. Alternately, one could start partway down the ramp and just go up to the sidewalk, and that would probably involve much less digging and less land acquisition. Alternately, one could think about whether you even need this access. You know, there's this sort of block on Alma has no, it's all backyards, fences. So, but that's just a possibility. Next slide. I think this has already been discussed. I think you should pursue with Caltrain. It doesn't make sense that they need this extra 10 feet of landing just because of the jog in the road. And by eliminating it, they will also allow them to inspect the wall, which is something that they've asked for the ability to do.
Your time is up.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sean.
Hi, my name's Sean. I know this may be an unpopular opinion, but I'm thinking we need to consider voting to actually remove the partial underpass as an alternative for Churchill. I've heard a lot of the concerns around us having no money, us delaying decisions. I mean, we just keep pushing this out. I mean, we've been here many years, pre-COVID, during COVID, whether it's in person in the other room, or whether it's remote through Zoom. But the fact is there's no money, and we just keep on pushing out this decision and no one's gonna make it. So if we can make it here, that's great. If we can make it on the 10th, that's great. I would strongly want everyone to consider just closing down to Churchill and focusing on the bike path or getting the kids safely from Old Palo Alto to Pali. And so that's kind of my priority here today. Hopefully you guys hear us. There's a lot more people to come, but I'm hoping for a decision sooner than later.
Our next speaker is Janice.
Hi, I second what Sean said, and I also agree with what Kathleen and Neva said. I am concerned about a lack of transparency. My mother lives right on the corner of Alma and Churchill on 102, so she's going to lose, both sides. Right now, it's already a hazard for her she's 75 years old. It's already a hazard for her to back out of the driveway. We don't have a driveway that you can go around or whatever. We have to back out into the oncoming traffic on Alma. And as Kathleen said, that's already dangerous now with a light, and we have to wait till it's red so that we can try to safely back out. With no light, I don't even know how that would happen. And with no, more space taken, it's already at the edge. There's no space already. So even a few feet is not going to work. So I don't know what's going to happen there. I don't understand why there's no alternative conceptual designs right now, and there's only one. Why there hasn't been any others presented right now. And in terms of property value and eminent domain, I think Kathleen is right that we are in the least expensive area. And if my mom were not to be able to get out safely and have to move, she would not be able to live in Palo Alto, period, or a place nearby. So thank you.
Our next speaker is Amanda.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Brown and I live at 1433 Alma Street. I want to start by expressing my appreciation for the opening comments by Chair Burt and appreciative of the efforts being made to minimize property impacts and come up with a solution that works for property owners along this corridor as well as the entire community. I think the implication behind referring to us as new faces is that we have not been involved or informed up to this point. I can only speak for myself, but I have followed this project very closely and have not inserted myself because I had been satisfied with how the project was being handled, and I'm realistic about the potential impacts associated with grade separation and living near a train. What I don't love is the continued evaluation and tolerance for any alternative that involves property acquisitions and the minimization of their significance by terms like sliver acquisitions. I'm here to express concern around the accuracy and availability of the facts around the potential property acquisitions being provided to the community and decision makers. They're being referred to as slivers, whereas for some properties like mine actually represent a considerable portion of my lot. My lot, 1433, which is mislabeled on the slide as 1435, is only 1,400 square feet. I'm part of a 3-unit condominium project, and whereas the 195 square feet would only represent 3.9% of a standard 5,000 square foot lot, it represents 14% of my property being taken away from me and the loss of my off-street parking spot where I unload my 1-year-old son from his car seat. The percentage is almost 3 times the impact of that experienced my direct neighbors, and their impacts are already significant as well. When I reached out to Mr. Boccia to gain clarity, he admitted that he did not fully understand my property, and I was told that we only looked at the parcel maps and just assumed it was a 5,000 square foot lot. When I reached out to XCAP member Nadia, I was told that if the acquisition was going to take a large percentage of my property, they would, quote, probably just take the whole thing, end quote. I also heard XCAP member Keith Rectal say that the city should have never published the potential property acquisition maps as it makes it impossible to do anything. The flippant response about my home where I raised my son is abhorrent, and if this is any indication of how these decisions are being handled, I'd call upon you to demand better of the leaders involved in this project to increase transparency. If you were going to lose 14% of your property and the information was not being accurately portrayed to the decision makers, what would you do? Further, the residents along this strip are already set to bear the brunt of the traffic and construction impacts associated with the project, regardless of whichever option is selected. I ask you to revisit the assumptions and demand that the design alternatives considered and evaluated only include those that can be designed within the right-of-way with 0 property impacts to the homes along Alma, including the option to close Churchill. The property impacts, please distribute them equitably rather than concentrating them on a few homes. Moving forward, please demand better. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sabrina.
Hi, thanks very much. I don't have specific comments, more clarification questions. And in fact, actually the earlier questions by council member around the Charleston Meadow hybrid versus underpass options already answered a lot of my questions. In terms of transparency and outreach, I understand there's been many, supposedly thousands of postcards or letters sent out. However, I am a property owner. I own a property backing onto Charleston that would be quote unquote partially impacted, but I think it's about 50% of my lot. Okay. And as a property owner, because I'm renting the property, I have had no notification at all. So I request that we notify property owners because that list is very easy to find versus just dropping off things in mailboxes, assuming that, property owners will get that information. In fact, I was lucky because my tenant notified me. And then on, sorry, I missed my, in terms of, since currently we're looking at underpass and hybrid options, and it sounds like we're prioritizing the South Palo Alto work higher than the potential Churchill work. I would like to understand a little bit more as to how those options would be compared, because obviously if we frame and do renderings in certain ways, certain options might appear better from a visual perspective. I believe that separating the separation of the communities, if we have a big separation anyway by Alma Street and the railroad tracks, I'm not sure that a hybrid option that's significantly less expensive, that wouldn't impact any properties, would be much worse in terms of east-west separation in the community. And then finally, the criteria that was reviewed included that there would be efforts to reduce the traffic on the neighborhood streets. It would be useful to understand how that's being evaluated. I just recently found out about all of this stuff, and if I need to just find out how to understand these processes a little bit better, I would appreciate getting some direction as to who I should follow up with offline. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Brigitte on Zoom.
Thank you for your time today, Rail Committee. And thank you, Helen, my neighbor. Your garden is remarkable. I love it. It's part of the joy of walking on Alma. My name is Bridget Riley, and I'm a mom and I'm a scientist, so my focus is on safety and data today. The Churchill partial underpass proposal as is has serious pedestrian, bicycle, auto traffic, and housing safety issues, even with the updates that were shared today. Respectfully, when the decisions were being made to move forward with the conceptual partial underpass design, the proposal was incomplete with inaccurate data. Specifically, whether there would be property acquisitions and the addition of this third northbound lane on Alma. The original partial underpass conceptual design only had one northbound at-grade lane. The additional lane was added later, setting a city zoning fire code. Though the conceptual design is being sold as small property takes, this is very far from the reality. The degree of harm on partials around Churchill and Alma is high. There's currently very little room between homes and the 50-mile-an-hour Alma traffic. By taking driveways and entire yards of some properties and adding the fifth lane of Alma right next to homes, this will destroy the livability and create imminent 24/7 danger of those living in these homes. The current conceptual design does nothing to address the current safety and traffic bottlenecks on the Churchill corridor. At a high level, why would we as a community spend millions of dollars on a plan that does nothing to address the traffic and safety concerns that are currently in existence at the Churchill-Alma corridor? A fifth lane of Alma traffic is not needed. It makes no sense to have 3 northbound lanes on Alma merging down to only 1 block. And I know I brought that up last time, so I won't go into it, but this will be a traffic nightmare. Widening Alma at Churchill makes little sense here. If any change is to be made, it's a road diet, not an expansion that should be considered near Palo Alto High School. I want to go into a little bit more detail so you can visualize what's happening. The traffic flows during Pally's start and end hours currently have cars backing up for blocks on Alma. Alma essentially becomes 1 lane northbound at the left turn lane to Pally, and this clogs up and overflows back into the second Alma northbound lane. This won't change or be alleviated with the partial underpass. What's common practice then is for cars to avoid this weight by overshooting Churchill north and heading to Kellogg to make hurried U-turns in people's driveways and then turning back left across multiple lanes of Alma southbound so they can make a right onto Churchill westbound. All this traffic backs up on Kellogg and is unsafe. None of this will change with the partial underpass. It will just move to Melville. And instead, they'll be going across 1 additional lane of Alma. This is not safe. We have thousands of Palo Alto students and Castanea students. I'm out of time, so I want to urge the committee to reevaluate the cost associated with the viaduct before moving to the engineering phase with the partial underpass and work together with Caltrain and/or revisit complete closure. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Philip.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for the time. Last week, May 15th, there was an accident at Alma and Embarcadero where the 2 northbound lanes merged to 1. On May 2nd, there was an accident at Alma and Churchill. Next door has a picture showing a car with a dent in the driver fender and a caved-in windshield. I don't know the details, but given there's a bicycle in the picture, it looks like a bicyclist ended up landing on the windshield of a car traveling on Alma. Safety is a huge issue at Churchill and along Alma in general. Thank you to the City Council for trying to improve safety for all of Palo Alto. The partial underpass does not improve safety. Yes, a bike underpass will, but the auto situation and safety of pedestrians and residents on Alma will be worse. The partial underpass would reduce the median between the sidewalk and 50-mile-per-hour Alma traffic. The elimination of the Churchill northbound light will only make cars travel faster. This new 5th lane of traffic will run dangerously close to homes. The marketed partial takings of property on Alma does not appear accurate. This seems to be all for an unneeded lane of Alma due to fire code. The city planning department says Alma is a special 24-foot setback zone now. These partial takings don't add up. There are 3 very old homes on Alma that only have a 10-foot setback from Alma. I don't see how there is room for a 5th Alma lane. The proposed partial taking creates high severance damages to the Alma properties. For example, taking 10 feet of yard on a corner house means it will lose 40% of its rebuildable housing footprint based on current setback zoning. There is little value of a property lot that can only have a 10-foot wide house should a car accident or earthquake occur, taking out that building. This partial underpass, initially creative, has grown in scope, in costs, and in eminent domain. The partial underpass is a partial solution at full costs with none of the traffic benefits of an unmetered auto traffic grade separation. Full cost, no traffic benefits. Traffic flow is not improved. Residents, bicyclists, pedestrians will face increased safety issues. At 8:30 a.m. today, northbound traffic on Alma was backed up 5 blocks from Churchill to Rinconada because of the left turn light to Churchill. This is Pali traffic. This is every day. This won't change with the partial underpass. At 8:45 a.m. today on Kellogg, half the block is stacked with cars waiting to turn left south onto Alma. These are Pali-bound students who overshoot north to bypass the Churchill left turn backup. This happens every day. This will not change. With the partial underpass, this traffic will just move to Melville or into Professorville. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Gary.
Hello, and thank you for the time. My wife and I own a home on Seal Avenue near Alma, and so.
Sir, would you mind speaking up, please? We're having trouble hearing you in the room.
Oh, sorry. Hello. So my wife and I own a home on Seal Avenue near Alma, and so of course we're quite interested in the proposed Seal Avenue pedestrian underpass. We've owned our home there for 30 years, raised our kids there. And I'd like to point out that we only heard about this in the past, the possibility of this in the past few days. And over those few days, we've talked to a number of our neighbors, and none of them were aware that this was a possibility. So I think community outreach needs to be improved. All of us have serious concerns about how this will impact things like property values. And in our case, in my wife and I's case in particular, we're wondering about things like how it will impact our ability to rent the in-law unit that we have behind our house, and and whose income we rely on. And of course, we have a lot of concerns about safety, traffic flow, loss of street parking, and how much of our property might be taken away. So in short, we'd like, more information on all these things, more clarity. And also we'd like to hear more about the justification for this. I have trouble seeing why it would be necessary for a variety of reasons, including the existence of a pedestrian underpass already nearby at Cal Avenue. So anyway, thank you for your time.
Our next speaker is Michael.
Good
Michael,
afternoon. Yeah, good afternoon to the Rail Committee. As a longtime resident of Charleston Road, I understand the need for grade separation, but I strongly oppose the Charleston underpass plus roundabout option. This option comes with massive costs, a 6-year construction timeline, and most importantly, tremendous property impacts, 3 full and 30 partial property acquisitions. If implemented, a disproportionately large burden will be put on the affected families. Yes, we have just heard again that only the underpass plus roundabout option will achieve a traffic flow grade that is better than D to F. But should that be the most important criterion? Does Palo Alto want to be known as a city that displaces its citizens to maximize traffic flow, given that other options were viable? The hybrid comes with no forced property acquisitions and should hence be preferred. Of course, there will be visual and noise impacts. Yes, affected residents will sometimes see a train in the sky. In my opinion, these adverse effects cannot outweigh the devastation that the displaced families would face if the underpass plus roundabout option was selected. Moreover, I consider the roundabout unnecessary. The underpass option is feasible without the roundabout. The main purpose of the roundabout is to enable a left turn from northbound Alma onto West Charleston, a pattern which is thwarted by the underpass. However, the same pattern is already accommodated by the existing infrastructure, and it can simply stay like that. The roundabout enables this turn by allowing a right turn from Alma onto East Charleston, then going back over the roundabout through the underpass towards West Charleston. Instead, we can simply take a right turn into Ely, proceed through the Ely-Mumford neighborhood, and take a left turn onto East Charleston at the Mumford-East Charleston crossing. No roundabout needed. According to your own data, this turn pattern amounts to only 23% of traffic turns in that direction, 360 cars per hour at peak, which amounts to a single car every 10 seconds at peak. The Ely-Mumford neighborhood can accommodate this additional traffic with ease. The roundabout is designed to support 2 more turn patterns, which the underpass dwarfs. These are of even less importance. They amount to 7% and 15% of traffic turns. Most importantly, these patterns will also be enabled by the Meadow Alma underpass by using Meadow instead of Charleston. In summary, the roundabout makes little to no sense, and the costs and collateral damage are simply too high. What's the point of taking this early conceptual design to further stages if it has already been discredited? If property impact minimization really is the top priority of the City Council, as just stated by Pat Bird, then honor this and stop this design, which has the highest property impacts here and now. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Patrice.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Rail Committee. I'd like to thank XCAP, and I'd really like to thank the Planning Committee because I do feel in the very near term, we have received a lot more information about the options. Ripon has been wonderful. It's not one time I've called the office that I haven't got an answer, even if it's an answer I don't like. And to be quite frank, I don't like the answers. For decades, we've been told by the Rail Committee, XCAP, and the Council that the last thing we want to do is to take citizens' homes. Let me help you. Then the first thing you should do as the Rail Committee is to reject any grade separations choices that include forced housing acquisitions. The most equitable solution for all Palo Altans must be one that does not involve any property takes. Therefore, moving forward, can we please prioritize the hybrid or viaduct designs as they do not include taking any homes? I'd also like to take a second to reiterate that we can market speak however we want. The difference between eminent domain and a forced housing acquisition, but the imbalance of power says it's still forced. And as a person living on Charleston Road with my neighbors facing this, we feel like we're in a house of cards built on quicksand. So our homes are our homes. We do not want to leave them. Nobody here wants eminent domain or a forced housing acquisition where even the negotiation puts us at the bad end of it. Please understand, a lot has been made about the fair market value. Fair market value does not begin to compensate us for the devastation full property takes will have on families, not economically, socially, or emotionally. Currently, with the current economy, we have less buying power. We're looking at higher mortgage rates. Every aspect of a real estate transaction has gone more expensive. People would likely be forced out of our community, literally banished for living on the wrong side of the track. This is unacceptable. It is not the Palo Alto way. People will be forced to relocate out of our neighborhoods to new schools, longer commutes, increased childcare costs, finding new medical providers. People will be forced to delay their retirement, take on second jobs to finance a new home in a new city that they never wanted. As the city strives with the new housing element to increase diversity within Palo Alto by offering housing that is financially accessible to more families, I applaud this, but I also urge the council to prioritize a plan that prioritizes rehousing families facing full housing takes so they can stay within our communities. I'm asking the Rail Committee, please reject eminent domain and make the goal to move traffic, not families. Thank you very much for your time and your consideration.
Our next speaker is Catherine. Catherine, you should be able to. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So this is Catherine. I'm living on Charleston Road. So my house looks like my front yard will partially taken off. So I think one resident tried to modify their building to apply for permit. City always told the residents you need to have at least 20 feet setback, including the roof edge even. So they said this is for your family, your community, safety, also beauty, lots of reasons. You must live at least 20 feet. But now, you know, in my house front, I measure it only about 22 feet setback. So after you take a partial, definitely it will less than 20 feet. Also, our 2-bedroom, the kids' room right on the circle will be. So if the city doesn't allow residential to, you know, to require residential to maintain the 20 feet setback, how come one city build the road, you don't obey the code, right? Leave the 20 feet, right? You should be equal. That's my first question. The second question, the traffic on the Charleston, I don't think it will improve traffic. Now I count, there will be 5 direction traffic will be focused on the small traffic circle. Yeah, at least 5 direction. So there will be a lot of traffic. The traffic mark, currently we only have 3, I think 3 or 4. Now after the traffic circle, you will have more traffic. Folks turn around, also they will slow down. Lots of traffic. I think in the morning, and around the traffic, we have at least 6 or 7 families. It's harder for us to back to the street, to go to the work, go to the school in the morning rush hour, I guess. So this doesn't improve traffic. It will create much more traffic. Yeah, that's my bigger concern, you know. Also, since we have the other option, like build the viaduct, why we can't just avoid, you know, impacting to the personal property, you know. Also, I noticed when you build the construction will take a couple years. So during a couple years, I noticed on Charleston, we at least we have about near 10 families. How we go home, go out, go home, we have kids go to school, we have to go to work. How can we how we survive, you know, for this year? We concern a lot. Okay, thank you.
Our final speaker is Linda.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so good afternoon. I appreciate for the information provided by this meeting. And after listening to the details of each option, I really couldn't see any advantages of underpass option compared to a hybrid option. So underpass option will affect many families and many people due to full and partial acquisition. I'm the owner of a property on Charleston. I believe everybody agrees that home is the most precious for us, the owner of properties, especially for the seniors of Palo Alto who work and live in Palo Alto for 20 or more years, which is the case of us. Because we live here, we raise our kids, and we work here for more than 20 years. And now we are senior, but now we have to face this disaster if the city choose this option. So I really hope the city to consider 2 aspects seriously. Losing homes for many families for underpass option, or worse, physical will for hybrid option, which is more important for Palo Alto citizens. I really hope the city council and community members stand on the position of owner of properties to consider to make decisions and consider the economic cost and effect of each option, and also consider the time duration of each project. So my point is that I really hope the city councils and the community members to know that the Palo Alto citizens want to stay in Palo Alto. We don't want to remove our families out of Palo Alto. So I really hope the city consider our voice of property owners who may take out, whose house may be taken out. Thank you.
That concludes public comment.
Thank you. So we'll return to the committee for discussion, and really I want to make sure we're understanding what we're focusing on for June 10th. Actually, Ripon, there's nothing related to Churchill that we'll be referring on June 10th. Is that correct?
No additional referral is needed.
Okay. So
for either one, if the council doesn't, if the committee doesn't want have any additional referrals. Yeah.
Okay. And there were legitimate concerns on the standard setback for homes. Do you have any insights on that?
So my understanding is that there may be variances required, and if so needed, the city can look into those variances and work with the property owners as well as the city to provide those variances. But again, we are going to do our due diligence in reducing those impacts, and hopefully
That's the more important one,
yes.
which is that.
Thank you.
And I do recall now when we, I guess a year and a half ago or so, when we were looking at this design, and at that time the staff had come forward with elimination of the planting strip and the sidewalk right up against Alma with presumably some side of a type of a barrier fence. It was, I think it was actually Lydia who made, I think, the good point that no, we need some buffer there. But that's actually what then resulted in, under the current design, moving into that 4-foot acquisition of properties along there.
Yes, that buffer required that.
Yeah. And I think that decision was unanimous by the committee that we did want to have a buffer. Okay. And I'll just say that there's at least one of the speakers made the point of, well, why can't we have these answers on design before we select a preferred alternative? And this is something that we have gone through umpteen times, because we'd really like to have all the answers before we narrow our alternatives. And what has been explained to us repeatedly is that those, unfortunately, you have to narrow your alternatives, then go into the very expensive engineering and attempt to address any design issues that remain. And that's what we're looking at now. Okay, so Ed, did you have any thoughts?
Well, I think we're right to first focus on this June 10th consideration. Whatever we have to do to make that happen in the time we have left. But we do have these bigger issues of, given what's happening in the state government and with Caltrans' lack of ridership, should we be looking to kind of scale back the decisions now? And I don't think we have to talk about that on June 10th, but we have to talk about it. So.
Just on that topic, it's been a big frustration of mine, because if you ask me personally, what I think is that the new business plan will scale back the long-term projections on for Caltrain. And unfortunately, we don't have that info, and it's not imminent. And so what we really are looking at is Churchill, that we're going to refine the design, but I think most of us are anticipating that there's a very good chance that that's going to be put off at best, just like we talk about high-speed rail. It's not going to happen soon. It may never happen. And I think that's kind of where we are with Churchill. But we don't at a point where we can make that decision based on the information we have. So I think in my mind, on Churchill, proceeding with refining the design and attempting to address the concerns, which I'm hopeful that we will be able to largely address those. I think that's, we continue on that path. I did want to note too that one of the speakers was talking about going east-west in the bike traffic, and maybe it's not fully understood, but that's why we're looking at investing in a completely grade separation bike and pedestrian crossing that would feed the Pali kids into Pierce Park, right? And then right into Pali from there, and make it safer and more efficient, and not having to wait at the signal, which we all witness is highly dangerous today. All the kids coming through and in opposite, riding on the wrong side of the street and in a pack, because they with having a signal to cross and signal and a train to cross, they gang up and then all go at once. Whereas with an underpass, they go smoothly in a steady flow. So that's the concept of why we're looking at investing in that, to give real improved bike and pedestrian flow across Alma and the tracks. I did want to, there's also a important concern that's raised on people backing out of their driveways. And that's one thing that I know Nadia and others have promoted the need for an additional signal, perhaps at California Avenue. And that's already a very long distance in the city with no signaling, and that's why we get such high speeds on a lot of that travel there. And it would provide that break that today we get from Churchill. Now, whether it's identical or not, that has to be further studied. But I just want to know that, want people to know that that's part of the concept that hasn't been decided, but is being evaluated. Julie?
Thank you. I just have a couple comments, Pat. Appreciate it. Appreciate everyone's presentation, staff, and to the members of the community who came out in person or on Zoom. It's an important, essential part of the process. My concerns today are about process and transparency and notice. I've been hearing from a lot of property owners, homeowners, in particular, who are only just finding out about the potential that their property is being impacted. And I'm sure my colleagues are hearing these things as well, and members of the public have come today to share that. And I appreciate that staff says that they have indicated for some years now that multiple property acquisitions could potentially have to happen depending on the option selected. But I think that's not the same as individual homeowners being notified of that potential. A gentleman called me to say he did not know his property was contemplated as a full acquisition until he read about it in the Palo Alto Weekly and saw the full color slide showing his home in red. He and his wife bought the house recently to get their children into our schools. Now it looks like they may have no home here at all. And he is feeling dismayed, disrespected. I think he would say that no one at the city told him before it ended up in the newspaper. And even though we have indicated that we're not yet at that phase, the maps with at least suggestions are now out. And if your home is on that list, is pictured in red or yellow, you're already experiencing a diminution in value, I am told. One resident told me that realtors do not want to list her property because it is red or yellow, because of the tremendous uncertainty and associated with it being even considered. So financial impacts are already being felt. So toward this end, I would like to ask you, Ripon, to share with us what efforts, because I know you've made efforts to notify people, what efforts have gone out to notify property owners whose property is potentially impacted?
Councilmember Litker-Hames, yes, the city has made more recent attempts to provide a mailer to all the fronting property owners within the project boundaries, and not just the property owners. We have sent notices to people within like 500 or 1,000 foot from the project boundaries, a notification card about this upcoming meetings, even April 29th meeting, this meeting, and the upcoming June 10th meeting. Previously, city also have sent this rail committee meeting itself is a public meeting and open to public, and it also provides opportunity for our community to provide feedback. These meetings are noticed meetings. These are Brown Acted meetings. All the meeting minutes are notified and published. And people who have subscribed to those these meetings, they get notification in mail of on regular basis. Previously, for during the XCAP and CAP meetings, there were also notifications to all the people who were on the list of those people who were actively working on or have asked us to put on their contact number on the email on the list, and they were all notified about those meetings at that time also. So you know, and I think we also send out our Transportation Connect newsletter, and Transportation newsletter also provides updates on regular basis about the project status, the discussions, and the rail committee meetings and the council actions that are planned. So,
Thank you. I think what I'm gleaning from this is that we are putting out notices about meetings. We are inviting people to sign up for information, and that's all necessary and important as part of the Brown Act. The implication is that they may, if they choose to come to a meeting, to log into a website, they might learn on a slide somewhere in a very thick deck that their property is one potentially being considered for full or partial acquisition. And I think what we're hearing is that people would like more information than that. It has been alleged that a member of the Planning and Transportation Commission said offhand that we shouldn't have published those maps. One of the public commenters said that today. I'm just acknowledging that. Now that the maps are out, or that the slide is out with potential acquisitions listed, we're going to have a hard time getting anything done. I want to suggest that to the extent that that is true and was a feeling of the past, the cat is now out of the bag, and we've got to figure out how to be in relational conversation with people whose properties are potentially impacted, really as a matter of dignity and respect, which I know we all want to be treated with. Everyone in this room does. I think toward that end, you know, my sense is that we can do better, and we're going to have to, as hard as it is. I also want to acknowledge that just being at this meeting today and running through slides quickly depicting your home partially or fully impacted in yellow or red, I want to hold space for the fact that some people in this room may have found those slides and this conversation upsetting, as it impacts your home, your asset, your garden, your family, your son, your future. We can't change the fact that grade separation needs to happen. These are tough conversations for a community to have. None of us want to sugarcoat it. None of us want to hide our heads. As we move forward toward narrowing options and putting homes on the map as potential full or partial acquisition, I want to simply acknowledge that we can probably speak with greater consideration for the people involved and the impacts, and it underscores how essential a really good process continues to be. We've had a process for years now, and now as we narrow, it's going to get more emotional, and the trade-offs are going to become clearer, and we're going to have to work really hard to respect the human beings involved in every aspect of this process. I don't have any answers right now. I just want to acknowledge the pain in the room and the inherent painful nature of this process for our community. Thank you.
Just add that even with the hybrid, we right now don't have folks focusing on all the people along Park who will suddenly have a 16-foot earthen wall right up against their back. So we have trade-offs in every one of the alternatives. And on the noticing, we had one member of the public say, well, they're a property owner, but it's a rental property. Are we attempting to get notices to the property owners when they're rental properties as opposed to the resident who may be a renter?
I believe at this stage, we are sending it to the property addresses so that property as a resident is informed and can inform the tenant or owner. But as we move into the future next stages, there will be more.
Well, one of the dilemmas
deliberate.
is we don't have a active rental registry yet, so I don't know how readily we would even know which property is a rental through any records. There isn't a registry, so that's a bit of a dilemma. But what we maybe should do is attempt to solicit any through our communications, any property owners who do not reside at the properties to please give us their contact info, and we'll make sure things get directly to both the renter, resident, and the owner. Okay. Any wrap up? We're going back to the council, looking at whether really on June 10th on the focus is whether at the Charleston Meadow, we would narrow it to 2 alternatives. That's really what our decision is about on June 10th. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
No, per your input, staff, Ripon, we need to do that for the other grant. So that's sort of independent of what's going to happen now in the next couple of years, given the state lack of budget. So.
Yeah. Okay, I think that completes our meeting unless anybody else has anything. All right, and we're adjourned. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.